The Wild West is one of those historical settings that feels familiar, yet is surprisingly hard to pin down. Even though it's relatively recent, the boundary between fact and fiction is incredibly hazy. A big reason for that confusion is the iconic cowboy archetype. In reality, cowboys mostly did what their name suggests, herd cattle and not much else. But popular culture has piled a mountain of exaggerated traits onto them. On screen, they're often portrayed as something far more dramatic. Ahem. Almost drifted into fangirling about charming Matthew Mercer characters, but let's stay focused. The name's Blue. Time for a history lesson. Take McCree, for example. He actually proves the point. He's not shown wrangling cattle. He's depicted as a gunslinger, a heroic vigilante roaming the frontier for justice, America, and occasionally an objective marker. The problem? Gunslingers, as we imagine them, didn't really exist. It's surprising but true. Most frontier towns had strict gun regulations precisely to keep things from descending into chaos. Because shockingly, letting everyone carry guns around caused more trouble than it prevented. So yes, the Wild West had gun control. Who would have guessed? There were lawmen like Wyatt Earp or Bass Reeves, who famously made over 3,000 arrests, but they were rare exceptions rather than the norm. To really understand the American West, we have to rewind. The roots of the cowboy trace back to the 1600s and 1700s in Central America, where Spanish colonists used their horsemanship to manage cattle. Over generations, after Mexico won independence from Spain, this evolved into the vaquero tradition, literally the original cowboy. And considering that one-third of present-day America used to be Mexican territory, much of the early West was shaped by Mexican and Native American culture. Unsurprisingly, this led to major cultural crossover. Many of the classic Western visuals, chaps, lassos, bandanas, wide-brimmed hats, come straight from Mexican vaquero traditions. Things shifted again when American settlers moved westward, picked up those practices, and began working as vaqueros themselves. Or buckaroos, if Spanish wasn't their strong suit. Westward expansion had been ongoing for a long time, but events like the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, the discovery of gold in California in 1848, and the rapid spread of railroad networks made movement across the continent much easier than the old Oregon Trail days. That's when Manifest Destiny kicked into high gear. Masses of people left the East to head past the Mississippi in pursuit of land grants and government-backed opportunities. Contrary to the myth of the West as a rugged refuge from big government, the region was heavily shaped by federal support, railroads, homesteads, and settlement incentives. In 1800, most believed it would take centuries to reach the Pacific, but strong national policies sped everything up dramatically. While some of the expansion was peaceful, much of it was not. And that brings us to the messy legacy of cowboys versus Indians. I've said before it's a can of worms that explodes the moment you touch it, and here's the short version of why. The classic story paints cowboys as brave defenders fighting off savage Native Americans who supposedly threatened American progress. But actual cowboys didn't fight Native tribes. The U.S. government did, using two major strategies during the Plains Indian Wars of the mid-19th century. First, direct military confrontation. The popular trope suggests a fair fight, but reality was drastically skewed. Soldiers pushed westward, killing Native people, who retaliated, and the violence spiraled as each side fought for their survival and land. The second tactic was the deliberate destruction of the bison population, a cornerstone of Plains Native economies. Through intense hunting and habitat destruction, bison numbers plummeted from around 40 million to only a few hundred in the span of a century. Brutal doesn't begin to cover it. If you've seen my earlier discussion about Buffalo Bill, you'll know just how enormous this slaughter was. So the whole cowboys versus Indians idea falls apart because, first, cowboys weren't fighting anyone, and second, the U.S. government had overwhelming power due to firearms, military resources, and the catastrophic impact of smallpox outbreaks that devastated Native populations long before these conflicts. I wish the conflict had simply been a dramatic showdown between two vibrant groups of fighters, but the truth is far harsher. What actually happened was a deliberate campaign to dominate Native peoples and seize their land and resources, because the government had the power to do so. So in reality, it was less yours versus mine, and more mine because I can take it. Now that America controlled this enormous territory and California was flourishing with its gold rush boom and growing coastal cities, what about the rest of the West? That huge stretch in the middle. Even today, it's sparsely populated, and it wasn't much different back then. Outside of scattered family ranches, communities formed around railroads, resource-rich areas, and, predictably, though amusingly, brothels. Aside from that one glaring exception in the 1860s, when the Civil War nearly tore the nation apart, westward settlement and economic development marched on rapidly. And while a century might not sound like rapid growth, the comparison puts it into perspective. The eastern seaboard took nearly 300 years and multiple European empires to colonize. That coastline is roughly the same length as the stretch between Amsterdam and Gibraltar, and they had to cross an ocean first, so it wasn't a small feat. But in just over 100 years, the United States managed to expand into a thriving, resource-rich region 10 times the size of the original colonies. That's essentially a Roman Empire's worth of land developed in one human lifetime. After laying out all this history, I'll be completely honest. I don't think the West was wild at all. Considering the strong military presence, heavy government oversight and funding, and strict laws, it wasn't any more chaotic than it is today. The biggest difference is simply that there's more infrastructure there now. So after thoroughly stripping away the romantic image, where did the familiar myth come from? It largely stems from a handful of larger-than-life individuals, people who took this vast new region and lived stories that were genuinely extraordinary. Think Buffalo Bill, Annie Oakley, Butch Cassidy, Billy the Kid, the real-world Dark Knight, Bass Reeves, and many others whose lives were honestly incredible. Their legends fueled a massive appetite for entertainment, like Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which swept across the US and Europe. Once these figures became household names, new technology took over, Hollywood, and turned the Wild West myth into something unstoppable. To keep things brief, Hollywood got rolling largely because Thomas Edison was being, well, Thomas Edison. He owned a pile of patents on early film tech, but filmmakers realized that if they set up shop far enough away, in California, he couldn't realistically enforce them. A bold act of frontier-style lawlessness, if ever there was one. With perfect weather and varied landscapes, Southern California quickly became the ideal place to film movies, and the Western genre became their obsession. It took a few years to perfect, but the 1939 film Stagecoach with John Wayne became a massive success, launching Westerns into decades of popularity. These movies tapped into people's imagination with dramatic stories, building railroads, marshals chasing outlaws, outlaws fleeing the law, ranchers defending their land, and the U.S. military clashing with native tribes, classic, if embellished, Western scenarios. But nearly all these films shared one huge problem. The heroes were overwhelmingly white. Not only is that frustrating, it's historically inaccurate, especially since the real West was one of the most diverse regions in the country. The people who lived and worked there included white settlers, Native American nations, Mexican vaqueros, Chinese immigrants who were essential to building the railroads, and Black Americans who made up roughly a quarter of all cowboys. And that's barely scratching the surface. The truth is, the West wasn't built by one group. It was shaped by many different peoples, all living and struggling together in the same rugged landscape. It was a collective effort from beginning to end. The cowboy myth frustrates me so much because the so-called classic cowboy doesn't actually exist. The idea of a single, uniform cowboy archetype is a stubborn misconception that feeds into all kinds of uncomfortable American xenophobic narratives, and Western films are largely to blame. Thanks a lot, Hollywood. Across the Atlantic, though, a completely different style of Western emerged. It began with Sergio Leone's A Fistful of Dollars, featuring Clint Eastwood. These Italian-made Westerns, nicknamed spaghetti Westerns because, well, Italians made them, exploded in popularity across both Europe and the US simply because they were excellent films. Within a decade of Fistful of Dollars, Westerns made up half of all Italian movie productions. Unlike American Westerns, which at least pretended to stick close to plausible history, the protagonists in spaghetti westerns, like Eastwood's unnamed stranger, weren't sheriffs or outlaws. They were solitary wanderers with no allegiance, no concern for local disputes, and absolutely no hesitation toward violence. That became a defining feature of the genre. Take Franco Nero's Django. The character barely speaks, yet racks up an impressive body count. Hollywood, for all its melodrama, still had censorship guidelines that limited how much violence filmmakers could show. Italy had no such restrictions, so spaghetti westerns were bloodier, grittier, and far more chaotic. One of them literally features a man's ear being sliced off. It's wild, and that's the crucial difference. Italian filmmakers weren't worried about historical accuracy. They wanted excitement. So they embraced the fantasy, crafting the image of the lone gunslinger who could take on the entire world by himself. To put it simply, Hollywood turned cowboys into white heroes, while Italy turned them into unstoppable badasses. So to sum it all up, the myth of the West and the reality of the West are worlds apart. In truth, the frontier was a culturally diverse region, secured through conquest and developed by strong government infrastructure and profitable economics. The myth, meanwhile, is, well, it's high noon. Exactly. And there's nothing wrong with dramatizing history for entertainment, as long as you're honest about it. But presenting fiction as fact is dangerous, especially when those distortions reinforce harmful ideas. So yes, enjoy playing Red Dead Redemption 2 to your heart's content, but also remember that the more harmful parts of the Western legend won't disappear unless we acknowledge them. Or to put it another way, justice won't deliver itself.